Alright guys, hope you're doing really well. Today we're going to keep on going with our discussion on civil liberties and what they actually mean. And we're going to carry off where we left off on the last amendment, and we're going to be talking about now freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So what they are should be pretty self-explanatory. Freedom of speech, your ability to express your beliefs without fear of repercussions. And freedom of the press, the way to manifest your speech physically, whether it be media outlets or whatever. My question for you guys is freedom of speech absolute? Like, you can say whatever you want without any fear of repercussions or anything of that sort. Should be pretty self-explanatory. No, freedom of speech is not unlimited. And there are some pretty obvious things you cannot say in public. I'm going to go through 4 exceptions of freedom of speech that the Supreme Court has gone through over the years and what they may mean to you guys. So the first is incitement, which is the advocacy of the use of force. That's not protected by freedom of the speech. So inciting someone to do something bad or illegal is not protected by your freedom of speech. If you tell someone, hey, you should go commit acts of terror, or you should commit suicide, or you should rob a bank, if those people actually go through on it, you're going to be just as guilty as them. You can't say it was my freedom of speech to tell them that stuff. No, incitement's not protected by the First Amendment. Now, that does lead a discussion with seditious speech at that point, which, if you don't know what seditious speech is, it would be like the advocacy to attempt or overthrow something by force. Now, we are free to criticize the government of the United States. You can criticize the current administration. You can criticize the senator. You can criticize a justice. You can criticize your mayor. But advocating or attempting to overthrow them by force, that is not protected by freedom of speech. And the case that established that was a case known as Schneck versus the United States. It presented a case that made a standard called the clear and present danger test. Schneck was basically sending out leaflets in World War I, urging people to resist the draft. Basically, don't do it, man. The court determined that that speech, although he was criticizing the government for the draft, it presented a clear and present danger during wartime. It interfered with the government's ability to use the war powers, which is the ability to draft. So if he had published his leaflets during the end of World War I, criticizing the draft, he would have been fine. But the Supreme Court ruled that since it was during a situation, he was not fine. And that kind of leads to like stuff for you guys. Like, I'll use the movie theater example for you guys. If you go into a movie theater during like an Avengers movie and you shout fire and people panic and run out, that presents a clear and present danger for all the moviegoers. Shouting the word fire means nothing, but shouting it in a crowded movie theater creates a public danger. So freedom of speech is not protected in that sense. Now, what about fighting words? Well, fighting words or insults that are likely to incite a physical response or a breach of peace, that's not covered. And a couple of cases have gone through with that. However, just because someone is upset by an individual's ideas does not mean that the speaker will be punished. So an example of that could be like, you can make hateful claims about a religious group and not be punished by the government, but if you made outward threats against that group because of your hateful claims, that is not covered. There's a fine line you can't cross, in other words. But reality is, if you tell someone they're fat and they punch you to the ground, you're not going to be protected by freedom of speech. But does that include hate speech, though? And this is something that's really interesting. Every time I've asked this question, like, hey, is hate speech protected by the First Amendment? Or actually, what I ask in the middle or at the beginning of all this, I'm like, hey, what are the limits of freedom of speech? And most people write that saying hate speech is not protected. Well, the reality is hate speech is lawful and it is protected. However, when you cross the line from simply stating your hateful belief to making threats or inciting violence, then that speech is no longer covered by the First Amendment. Anywho, moving on. False statements of fact are not protected under the First Amendment. In the Supreme Court case Gertz versus Robert Welch, the Supreme Court ruled that there's no constitutional value in the false statement of facts. So that leads to the question, are unpopular views, libel, and slander protected by the First Amendment? Well, it depends the situation. So freedom of speech and the press are kind of intended to protect the expression of an unpopular view. So like if you didn't like Mr. Shoens' government class, well, That's just your opinion, man. So unpopular views are fine. Libel and slander, though, completely different story. Nobody has the right to libel or slander another. If you don't know what either is, libel is the false malicious use of printed words. Slander is the same thing, but they are spoken words. Now, the next limit on freedom of speech is obscenity, which is obscene gestures, child pornography, fight words, offensive speech. All that stuff is not protected by the First Amendment. And that does lead to an interesting scenario. So, obscenity, which is the offensive sexual contact that violates certain standards, is not protected under the First Amendment, but that does lead to a question of what is obscene. Now, the Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. California that there's a three-part standard to determine what is obscene. One, does apply your community standards, and does the work excite lust in any unnatural way? Two, does the work depict sexual conduct in a patently offensive way? Or three, does the work lack artistic, scientific, literary, or political value? Now, that could all be different depending on who you ask. So, for example, pornography is legal, but there's a fine line when it comes to child pornography, which is illegal. Some people might view both as perfectly fine, which is disgusting. Others might view both as perfectly awful. So, depending on who you ask, what is obscene is really a gray area, but regardless, freedom of speech doesn't protect obscene things. And the last one, commercial speech. This one's pretty straightforward. False advertising can be punished, and misleading advertising may be prohibited. And this also goes into stuff like intellectual property, which if you don't know what intellectual property is, Google is your friend. But let's move on now to some different forms of speech that isn't necessarily speaking. It's more of like physical actions, like symbolic speech. So you kind of look at that picture right there of an anti-abortion group and how none of them are actually speaking, but yet they have something on their face that says all that's needed. And that's obviously the word life. So there's symbolism in what they're doing, even though they're not physically speaking. Now, depending on the symbolic speech, the Constitution varies on whether the First Amendment protects it. And I'm going to look at two specific cases, Texas v. Johnson and U.S. versus O'Brien. So for Texas v. Johnson, it involved flag burning. You probably have seen one of these, whether it be TV or online. So the question is flag burning protected under the First Amendment? Well, twice the Supreme Court has ruled that yes, flag burning is protected by both the First and the 14th Amendment. Texas v. Johnson was the biggest case. It was a case where Johnson burned a flag in protest against President Reagan, and then Texas sued him because they thought it was awful. The court ruled in favor of Johnson. And kind of self-explanatory with this picture. It's like there's a flag there. It's like, well, I support your right to burn me. I just wish you wouldn't. And the reasoning behind this came from Justice William J. Brennan. If there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive. We do not consecrate the flag by punishing its desecration, for in doing so we dilute the freedom that this cherished emblem represents. There have been many attempts to change this. The Flag Burning Act of 1989 was one of them, but the Supreme Court ruled it as unconstitutional, so it went away. And that's because the Constitution is obviously the supreme law of the land, so they can do that with judicial review. There have been many attempts to actually get an amendment to try to change the Constitution to do that, but you obviously need 67 votes to get one done. So you kind of get the idea. And if you remember obscenity, obviously that could be viewed as obscene also. So you kind of get the idea that freedom of speech can be very gray. Now let's move on to another one, the burning of the draft cards, which is another symbolic speech without actually speaking. So the U.S. versus O'Brien. So that's how we got to Berean. So draft card burning is not protected by the First Amendment, even though flag burning is, because it interferes with a legitimate government power, which is the ability to draft an army. And the government's limitation was not for the purpose of squelching dissent. It was to protect their own power, because sedition is not protected. You can criticize the government, but you can't try to overthrow it. And obviously, trying to prevent a draft happening to get a military might argue as that. Now, student speech. There was one case that you guys kind of learned about last week with a packet, which was Tinker v. Des Moines, which basically saying that students still have reasonable free speech rights in school, even if they're in school, as long as they don't compromise the learning environment. So keep that in mind when you go to college. But what about speech that's kind of like online, like intelligent leakers or intel leakers? You probably heard of things like WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, right? If not, I really don't have enough time to explain that. So are people who leak intelligence to like Wikipedia protected by freedom of speech and expression? So I'll give you the short summary of Edward Snowden. He was a CIA employee. He basically found a bunch of stuff in our servers and said this is definitely downright bad. Too much to go on, but I'll just say the most popular one was that we spy on our allies. And then he leaked a ton of thousands of classified NSA documents to journalists, and then he flew out the country and it's still hiding in Russia. So is leaking classified intelligence protected by freedom of speech? No, of course not. Whether it be several acts which have been passed by Congress to prevent such a thing, or the fact that sedition is obviously not protected. So you get the idea. And I could bore you with a bunch of details like the Espionage Act of 1917, but it's pretty straightforward. It was against the law. The biggest thing is Snowden's not in jail right now. So why isn't he in jail if he literally leaked a bunch of intelligence to the media, which endangered the United States? Here's a fun fact. If you break the law and flee the country, the justice system gets a little bit more complicated. Countries go through a process known as extradition, which means that a country has to formally request the other country to get that person for you. You can't just cross the border with your police officers and grab a person. That's illegal and an act of war in some senses. If someone's fleeing the nation because they're a villain and they go to a country that's friendly to that country that they fled, then the country will probably be inclined to help out that country. But it only works if that country complies, so Snowden made a very smart decision to head to Russia, which has no interest of handing over someone who knows a ton of US secrets back to the US. So, although to be fair, Putin has said he might do it just as a measure of goodwill, but you get the idea. So, leaking intelligence is bad. Don't do it. If so, obviously know your plan B. What about the internet, though? Does freedom of speech and expression apply to the internet when the internet is the World Wide Web, not the American Wide Web? Well, that's something being debated even today. The very nature of the internet makes it very, very difficult, and the courts honestly really don't know how to do it constitutionally speaking, because not all countries should be applied to the Constitution. So, example, you could punish people in YouTube or the Wall Street Journal or something like that for things that are slanderous, libel, etc. But what if those videos are from other nations, yet people are watching it in the US? How would jurisdiction work in that sense? As of right now, platforms like YouTube, Facebook, etc. are considered private property, so those platforms are the ones to decide what it is and what their community standards are. So YouTube, Facebook, and stuff determine that they don't have to necessarily abide by freedom of speech. Again, something that's still being debated today. And probably in your lifetime you'll see some type of resolution to it, because obviously censorship of these platforms is no bueno. So there's your views and what freedom of speech and the press and the limits of those two freedoms.